when he was hospitalized the first time, he thought his parents had been replaced by Nazi replicas, and he was patrolling the house with a kitchen knife. That to my mind doesn't make him violent or nonviolent. He was reacting to something he thought was real that wasn't, and that was inherently dangerous. And a lot of people would say, well, that's not being violent. You can define it any way you want, but once you don't think what's real is real, that's when the door opens to chaos. It wasn't so much a story that I felt I had to tell, but an encounter or a reckoning with things. Michael was my best friend in childhood. And so he's bound up with that amazing time when you're not really thinking about anything critically. He also, we competed for everything. We competed with each other. We went to the same camp, the same schools. We both went to Yale. He was a much quicker study than I was. He read much faster. He had a photographic memory. So we both went to Yale, but he graduated in 3 years. He then worked for a year. We were both going to be writers. He was going to work for 10 years, make a pile of money, and then write. But in the first year of working, he began to develop the symptoms of schizophrenia. He had a psychotic break, but he had already applied to Yale Law School, and he went anyway. And so then he went to Yale Law School with schizophrenia, was much celebrated. There was a big profile of him in the New York Times. Hollywood bought his story. Just a man who had come out about his mental illness, who wasn't getting hired, but who was being open about himself. Hollywood bought his Life Rights publishing company, bid for his story, but then he stopped taking his medication and he killed somebody. So in addition to reckoning with my childhood, I was reckoning with this terrible thing that happened 25 years ago.
And could you always associate his brilliance, his sort of exceptional brilliance, with a sense that he had some sort of mental condition? Was the brilliance one side of a coin there?
I certainly never thought so. And partly because, as I say, in addition to reading so fast and having a photographic memory, he had enormous confidence. So for me, he was just like a touchstone of high mental functioning. I had learning disabilities, although they weren't diagnosed, so that I always felt I was hiding. There was always a feeling of concealment. He seemed all overtness. I was very shy. He was very bold. And so not only did he not actually seem to me like someone who was going to be ill someday, I was much more concerned about myself. That probably amplified the sense of everything being turned upside down when my parents called and told me that he was in the hospital, and his father said he's in a locked ward, a phrase I'd never even heard before.
But when he was diagnosed, I mean, when we're talking about these issues, it's really important, isn't it, to give context. So I know people who would represent mental health charities will say schizophrenia at its extreme manifestation can cause violent episodes, but by no means the majority of people who have schizophrenia are ever violent. And yet, clearly, an attitude by the establishment in the form of Yale Law was to say, here is a person with a mental condition. We need to show that we can handle people with mental conditions, and almost bend over backwards to show that having a mental condition is no obstacle to a career in academia. And that possibly was a problem, wasn't it? It was a problem because by bending over backwards that much, they effectively let someone who needed far more clinical intervention to not have that.
Yeah, and in a way that was emblematic of a whole culture that had taken shape when Michael and I were growing up. They really didn't have much experience with severe mental illness, which hadn't stopped them from clerking for judges who had changed commitment laws back in the 50s and in the 60s. And indeed, it was important to recognize how dreadful state hospitals had become, but the pendulum had swung so far that even to acknowledge the existence of these illnesses was somehow seen as limiting or giving too much credence to what they felt was essentially something socially constructed. So in a way, what I would say is that there was also a feeling that mental illness was a vast category, almost of like fungible disorders. But Michael had schizophrenia, which affects like 1% of the population. And inside that percent, there's a fraction of that percentage of people for whom medicine doesn't work or who don't take it. He came to feel the medication was poison. And so there is a way in which not only as a symptom of your illness, you reject the idea that you're ill, and you might even believe those trying to help you are, in fact, trying to hurt you. And so that was a devastating situation. And as one of his professors said to me, if I'd spent less time feeling what an amazing place Yale Law School was for taking Michael, I might have thought more about his actual experience. So what you say is exactly right.
And is that a problem here? Because one of the points that comes out strongly in your book is no one was doing this for malevolent reasons. You know, in some ways, this came from a good place, didn't it? This came from a sort of, and you can understand it, a sort of liberal desire to say mental impairment should be no obstacle to fair treatment, which is, of course, true. But equally, mental impairment can have serious consequences, and you're wrong. You're fundamentally wrong to somehow undervalue them.
I think that's true. And the subtitle of my book partly is The Tragedy of Good Intentions. And I think so many people felt that to acknowledge difference was to discriminate in the sense of the word, meaning to notice a difference and use it to demonize somebody. But there's another meaning of the word discriminate, just to make a distinction. Yeah. And in fact, with medication, then he, in fact, would have been able to continue functioning. And so there was, as you say, a fear that had developed that calling any kind of attention to a severe disorder was somehow going to be harmful to him, whereas actually the real way to destigmatize his illness would have been to give him the help he needed so that he wasn't associated in people's minds with this dreadful eruption. And in fact, when he was hospitalized the first time, he thought his parents had been replaced by Nazi replicas, and he was patrolling the house with a kitchen knife. That, to my mind, doesn't make him violent or nonviolent. He was reacting to something he thought was real that wasn't, and that was inherently dangerous. And a lot of people would say, well, that's not being violent. You can define it any way you want, but once you don't think what's real is real, that's when the door opens to chaos.
And at that point, it's not to say that he can't have some sort of supported life or he can't have been treated with dignity, but it's not the case that he can just be simply fated as some sort of poster boy for how accepting our society has become. And I think there's a fascinating thing that comes out of your book, which is our societal reaction to mental health has gone from the abhorrence of the asylum system in the Victorian and the mid-20th century to a time in which mental health is so discussed that it is considered to be, everyone is on a mental health spectrum and therefore it has to be accepted by everyone. And the risk there is that in some ways you can conflate mild mental unease with serious mental illness, with the result that you don't treat the latter with the seriousness that it deserves.
That's right. And in fact, I mean, the promise that was made when President Kennedy announced in 1963, which is the year Michael and I were born, that the cold custodial care of state hospitals was going to be replaced with the warm embrace of community care. The promise was that those who had previously been cared for by hospitals were going to be cared for in the community. But the community mental health centers were called health centers. And so if you're going to replace an institution that cares for those who are severely ill with an institution that speaks only of health, and that where the young workers often gravitated to helping many people who are disturbed for many reasons, then you are betraying the people in whose name you had closed an institution that had been caring for severely ill people for more than 100 years. And that's part of the problem, as you say. The almost Orwellian, but unintentionally Orwellian use of the word mental illness to mean everything that's in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, from arachnophobia, to schizophrenia, fear of spiders to schizophrenia. They're all covered by insurance, I suppose, and that's why they're in there. But if everyone is ill, no one is. And there are some people whose illness requires help. The other thing I would point out, and I found this quite tragic, is that although Michael was brilliant and palpably so, his professors came to realize quickly that he, in fact, couldn't do the work. And in their minds, one of his professors said to me, well, I figured he would be an advocate for people with schizophrenia who had been to Yale Law School. But Michael would always say to me, why would I work at Macy's when I can be a Yale lawyer? Whereas the professor had literally said, I never thought he would be a Yale lawyer. That was fine with me. So in his mind, he wasn't being accommodated, and he was given no reason to feel he was. And so that space was yet another gap between his own perception and reality that wasn't the result of his illness. That was just the result of people accommodating him beyond that point. There's a brilliant woman who went to Yale Law School when Michael and I were undergraduates there, Ellen Sachs, who developed schizophrenia, who had schizophrenia when she went to Yale Law School, who did everything and became everything we all hoped Michael might become. She won a MacArthur Genius Award. She wrote an amazing memoir, brilliant memoir of her battle with schizophrenia. She's a law professor. And so it's not as if it is only that the illness casts you out. It's just that she had to come to terms with her illness and with medication, and her journey was different.
And also, it's the very definition of special pleading, which is, of course, nobody in any community or in any group wants, which is if you're good enough for a job and you have some sort of condition, then you can become some sort of representative figure, how the condition doesn't get in the way. But if ultimately your condition is getting in the way, the very worst thing can be done, in this case, with absolutely appalling consequences, that you're made to seem to be an advert for something that you're actually not capable of.
Yes, Michael's college roommate, who was someone I was friends with too in college, who was a wonderful guy. When I called to talk to him, I learned he had died young of cancer. He had 3 young kids, but he had, on his deathbed, died weeping for Carrie, the woman Michael killed. And what he said was, all we thought about was how people were reacting to Michael, how they were accommodating him. And he said, I forgot about her. And I think many people felt that way afterwards, that it isn't only about accommodating him, it's a whole world of those around him. And partly, I didn't know Carrie, but making her present was also very important to me. I didn't want her to disappear from the story.
Well, the other part of the story which we should reflect upon, Jonathan, is the friendship. I mean, this is a guy that you grew up with, your lives were intertwined, and this book is a very thoughtful meditation on friendship. And of course, it's a friendship that ultimately had to end, didn't it? Because he's still around, but you stopped seeing him. I mean, because at some point, what happened? Explain that to us. Explain your view of that friendship now.
Well, the friendship had many phases, but it had broken down. It was beginning to break down even when we were about to go to college. I always felt a little bit that he was the hare and I was the tortoise, but we both got into Yale, and I felt I'd caught up. And he said to me that summer before college, he said, I don't think we're going to see much of each other at Yale. And I said, why not? And he said, you're just too slow. And so in a sense, and for all I know, already there was the dawning awareness in him, without naming or knowing it, of illness of a sort. I mean, he always had a tremendous sense of himself, but then there was this kind of almost grandiosity and I had always measured myself against him, but we were very close. But there had been all of these moments when something had kind of cracked. After he became ill, which was some years later, I visited him, but I was frightened visiting him. And I was glad I went, but it kind of reconstituted our connection along a very different set of lines. And then, just when I felt I was bestowing something on him generously, he became enormously successful because he sold his story of not getting hired, which the Times wrote about, to Hollywood. Ron Howard bought his life to make it into a movie. And so, first of all, when he was applying for law jobs as a law professor, he was told by his professors, don't tell anyone you have schizophrenia. And so at first he didn't, but he couldn't explain why he hadn't done many of the things, clerking for a judge, working for a law firm, that he was expected to have done. Then when he came out, as he said, as a flaming schizophrenic, when he tried a year later, he wasn't hired, but it caught the attention of this reporter. And so he became, in a sense, as well known simply for coming out as someone who talked about it. But when he sold his book, he went from having to mask his illness to talking about it. It became the very thing that had drawn the world to him and earned him more than $2 million. And I think that itself was a strange situation. Also, the story told in the profile of him was not quite his story. He was very offended that people asked if he ever became violent, he told the reporter, who dutifully recorded him saying it's a very hateful stereotype. And it may well be, but I knew that Michael had been patrolling his house with a kitchen knife. And so my own sense that people were filling in the narrative for him, even though it wasn't quite true. The way I always think of it is like it's in Jurassic Park where you're missing a little DNA, so you use some frog DNA because it looks a lot like the DNA, and you think, what could go wrong? So why dwell on this possibility that unmedicated, he didn't know what was real and what wasn't, or no one spoke about the fact that he wasn't able to do the work. And so the fellowship they created for him that extended his stay there by 2 years was, he told me, in recognition of his genius. And though he did exude brilliance, he couldn't do the work. So it was a more complicated thing. So he was trapped in a story that he seemed to be telling, but that wasn't quite his own. And then that Hollywood bought it and he had to tell it, and he went off his medication. And that too. I'm not, again, saying any of these are the reasons. He thought his medication was poison. He had a terrible illness that wasn't well managed. That's the tragedy of it.
But ultimately, the Hollywoodization of your story to someone who is paranoid is not going to be healthful, is it? This idea that he makes $2 million, anyone who might even have a semblance of concern about the manifestation of his illness being violent is immediately written off in that sort of liberal guilt that many of us feel as oh, that's just a hateful stereotype. So even basic care as to maybe there is a problem here is immediately dismissed. Almost that the Hollywoodization is going to be part of, you can't, how, he was going to be played by Brad Pitt. That can't not be a contributing factor in the end, can it? And do you wonder whether anyone connected with this story, again, not because they've done anything malevolent, but equally their actions have consequences? Do you reckon anyone feels guilt, the machine, the liberal machine, we're talking about academia plus Hollywood, feels anything there where they think, well, maybe we got this one wrong?
I was very moved, actually, interviewing the professors who had been his mentors at how much it was a reckoning for them, too. And I felt that way at many points. One of his professors said to me, I pretty much almost finished my interview, and he said, look, don't blame Hollywood, he said. Meaning, of course, Hollywood is in the business of manufacturing dreams. He said, if Hollywood is to blame, we all are. He said, Yale Law School gave the story to the Times. The Times gave the story to Hollywood. It's exactly as you say. I sort of think in a way it's like the end of Romeo and Juliet, all are punished. Yeah. In a way, everyone was implicated. Everyone was left astonished, mortified, ashamed to some degree that what they saw as an accommodation had actually been its opposite. And sometimes, you keep learning as you get older, that acknowledging something difficult along the way that's less gratifying for you personally is in the long run better for someone. And that is something I do hope people will take away from the book. It's not a preaching book. It's not a moralizing book, but don't lie if you can avoid it, because it ultimately, there will be a cost.
And I just wonder whether, this is maybe too big a question for you, Jonathan. The world is a very complicated place, but it's becoming more binary in its judgment of itself and other people. You can see how the world of social media reinforces that binary. This is a good example of how things are complicated and they're nuanced and they're difficult. And sometimes the thing you want to say for very good reasons is the very worst thing you should possibly be saying. And I wonder if that's a lesson, that sometimes you have to think difficult, complicated, nuanced thoughts, because actually that's how the world works, rather than what tribe you want to appease or please in public or on social media or within your sphere of influence.
I felt it very powerfully. I've never encountered a more crystallized example of it also. And that's what's so painful, because the people who usually wind up paying for it are the ones in whose name you're trying so hard to be just or righteous. Michael couldn't seek help for himself because he didn't know he was ill in the end once he stopped taking his medication. And so it would have been for others to say. There was a whole network of people, community psychiatrists, who were sort of watching over him. They were thrilled that he was going to Yale Law School in their minds, because in the 60s, when they had come of age, keeping people out of the system was the goal. They didn't think of saving him from his illness as nearly as much as they did saving him from the system. But there was one who, in a Cassandra-like way, kept trying to warn everyone and saying, even a good thing, if you're ill and are recovering, can be a setback, simply because it taxes you in all kinds of ways. And what he really needed was time, and maybe even space. He needed a concept of asylum, if not an actual asylum, and we don't grant people such things. But also the idea that it would be stigmatizing to acknowledge that when he was in a psychotic state, he would be dangerous to be around. Because people were unwilling to say that, even though if he had taken medication, it would have stabilized him. And if he couldn't have taken the medication, he might have been hospitalized. It might have saved his life, which was destroyed, and literally saved Carrie's life. He killed the person he loved most in the world. What more is there to say about that? And he was found not guilty by reason of insanity, which means that psychiatry recognizes there are states you are in when you are not responsible. But if someone had recognized that beforehand, then it might have saved his life. I mean, it might have saved his, his life as he had it then, and it might literally have saved Carrie's life.
Well, listen, Jonathan, it is such a it's such a nuanced story, because that all sorts of verities are at war in this, which is why it's so important that you tell it the way that you do. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. It's such a fascinating story.
Thank you so much.